A little bit different this episode of the EFL Debate Championship podcast. One of my big fascinations in football, and I suppose in life really, is leadership, different people's styles, and how people relate to one another, and why managers can succeed at one club or in one sort of set of circumstances and maybe not so much in another. And I can't think of a person better suited to examine this than Mike Holden from Fox Punter, who has been producing outstanding content in a really niche market for many, many years, studying all the EFL managers, Premier League as well. I don't care so much about the Premier League. But really excited to get stuck into this on this Championship podcast. Yes, welcome along to the latest Championship podcast here on EFL Debate. If you can get subscribed to us on YouTube and on Spotify, that would help us out a lot. But for now, delighted to be joined by my co-host, Oli Mann from the Sheffield United way. Just about recovered from Friday night, Ollie?
Yeah, obviously, coming off the back of a defeat, I'm never the same man. You know, let's go back to before last week. I was happy, I was smiling. But no, we've got over it. We have dusted ourselves off. And I was listening to your intro before. You were talking about somebody brilliant who you couldn't imagine to spend more time with in terms of their psychological profile and the way they bring things together. And I thought, oh, here we go. What a build-up I'm getting. I can't believe he's talking about me like this. Alas, it wasn't to be, but it's fantastic to have Mike here.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the size of my laugh might have been slightly insulting, so I'll try and keep it down to a chuckle in future, Ollie. Delighted to have Mike Holden here from Fox Punter. Mike, thanks so much for joining us this evening. I think we'll start with Chris Wilder at Sheffield United, somebody I've known in the EFL for a long time. I know Ollie has as well in terms of Sheffield United. But I wanted to. My big sort of theory on Chris Wilder is I think he judges things based on his own experience more than perhaps either other people's perspectives or on data. I feel like he likes to call things as he sees it in front of him. I can't imagine there's too many occasions where he'd go into the data room and come out with a different sort of opinion on things. I don't quite know how you sort of come up with a psychological term for that, but that's kind of my perspective on Chris Wilder. He likes to call things as he sees them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Experience is the big word there. He's streetwise, I suppose, a good way of putting it. If he's experienced it himself, then it's of value. If it's something he hasn't experienced, then he doesn't make guesses. So he won't take leaps based on something he has. But he's a guy that experiences a lot of things because he doesn't play a single way. He doesn't have a single way of doing things. He tries things out. He's happy to fail, in public, in the real world, and then come back with something stronger next time. So, yeah, I think it's a good way to sum it up, basically.
Ollie, it's interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, he's somebody who doesn't make guesses, as Mike said there. But this season, we've seen him go away from that tried and trusted 3-5-2. He has played other formations previously in his career, like at Oxford and at Northampton. But I suppose he's kind of gone away from that with more of would you call it a 4-2-3-1 with Sheffield United this season?
Yeah, exactly that. Obviously, we've tried a little bit of a different system and it's worked really successfully. It's been a really significant change for what we've maybe seen in the past, but it does seem to be working. It was interesting, I thought, on Friday night, actually, where we actually seemed to go back towards that five at the back, a little bit more comfortable in terms of that system. Obviously, we felt as though we were outmatched. We were playing against somebody who most people will sort of expect to be the best team in the Championship this season. And we paid them a lot of respect. And I think us going back to that system was really interesting in terms of how we saw that game playing out. And the fact that actually, clear, we almost had this inferiority complex going in, particularly around their strength in wide areas that made us want to double up in that space. But I think you're right. And I think Wilder's so interesting for this kind of sort of profiling or understanding, because he's a man who's had such fantastic success, particularly with United, almost more than anywhere else, where he's been welcomed. He obviously knows the fan base. He's from the area. But that difficulty in terms of transitioning it to some of the other teams in the Championship, that Watford, that Middlesbrough, I think it's really interesting seeing how he has struggled to adapt to some of those areas, particularly when they've had sort of, say, a higher influx of foreign players, say they've had a completely different culture in terms of how they work with the fans, is fantastic for United. But I am interested in, if you've got thoughts, Mike, on what maybe it was that meant it didn't quite work when he was going to Middlesbrough, when he's gone to Watford, and the impact that might have had, whether or not it is just a lack of familiarity.
I think, well, the Middlesbrough one surprised me because when he joined Middlesbrough, I thought it was a great fit. You know, the region, the type of football club it is, very similar to Sheffield United, very northern. He's a very northern type character. And I thought that was destined to work because I thought him and Steve Gibson as an owner, I just thought it might work quite well. But for whatever reason, I think it might have been chief executive level. Something wasn't quite right there. And then at Watford, I think it was a bit of a not hiding to nothing, a bit of a shot to nothing, should we say. It was the end of the season. It was one of those that he could easily frame it. This was only ever a short-term deal. I was never meant to stay that long anyway. It was, kind of let's try it out and see type thing. But there was also an element of, with the Watford job, we talk about him not making guesses or not, it's one where I feel like he didn't, other people are looking and think that's a bit of a basket case club there. That's not necessarily a great career choice. Wilder's not afraid of taking those kinds of risks in his career. Like I say, he's happy to fail. He's happy to make mistakes and then learn from them and come through the other side a better manager. And it didn't faze him one bit to take that job on, and it didn't faze him when he failed in it because he picked up valuable insights of, you learn just as much from doing something wrong as much as you do from doing something right. And if it's real world experience, then Wilder considers that a value. So he's not really afraid to get his hands dirty and to fail in jobs.
How do you square that though, Mike, with the other assertion you made that Wilder doesn't make guesses? Because, for instance, let's take this, let's explore this point that you made about him, somebody who likes concrete information, working with things he knows he can trust. How do you square that with a man that was willing to be adventurous and go to Watford, who a lot of managers would look at and say, I'm not sure about them?
Well, in that context, I'd say it's more about control and chaos. He's comfortable with chaos. He's not, the risk-taking comes from he's not afraid of new and different. He likes concrete stuff rather than abstract, guesswork, pattern recognition. He prefers to deal with real-world stuff. But when it comes to control and chaos, he doesn't want to do things the same thing over and over and over again. He's more comfortable with chaos. He's more like just suddenly randomly change. You've kept so many clean sheets. And then you suddenly change your formation at Ellen Road. He's perfectly happy doing that. And it was interesting because that was the dynamic at Ellen Road on Friday where it was a little bit out of his comfort zone. In fact, he kind of was, rather than sticking with what he trusted, he was in a bit of a dilemma because Leeds have these 6 players up front and he talked after the game of having spoken, they got together as a backroom team before the game and said, right, we really need to look at what worked for Southampton. Again, real-world evidence, but now we're out of our comfort zone now. It's not our real-world evidence. We're looking at what other teams have done now to try to get a result against this Leeds team, and we're going to try and copy it because we feel like if we go with the 4, we're just going to be too stretched. So it was a little bit out of his comfort zone because it was a little bit of guesswork rather than sticking with what was working for you. Yeah.
I think as well, one of the things, obviously, and this is where we get into obviously a really difficult scenario. Obviously, there's been a lot that's happened at Sheffield United in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And obviously, on a personal note, a lot that's going to have affected Chris Wilder with his relationship that he had with George Baldock, as well as the relationship that so many players in the team and around the club are going to have had there. How do you see that in terms of how Wilder's profile looks? I think he's conducted himself really admirably in terms of how he's handled that, in terms of the way that he's spoken in the press, in terms of the tribute he did himself towards George in the sort of immediate aftermath of that. But obviously picking a club up and helping us to recover through this while still trying to get results, it's obviously just going to be a really, really difficult time for the club and really difficult for Wilder himself as a man. How do you see that potentially playing out in terms of how he is in terms of handling his club, handling himself, and whether or not you think he can help guide United through this, or whether or not you think it's going to be even more of a struggle than maybe we would predict?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's difficult really to predict because it's just one of those things that knock you for 6. But at least in Wilder's case, I saw the interview he did afterwards. It's a brilliant interview, very, very authentic and genuine. And, he seems to get the tone right in these situations. That's what, and I think that's consistently the case. Give him any situation in the moment, he just gets the tone right. He just, and I think that in the moment aspect of him is probably what matters here. Is that it's let's put everything into perspective. This isn't. It's just a game at the end of the day. You know what I mean? We've all got families. This is things that are more important than the game when you actually think about it. And he's not one. His attitude from week to week, in any case, is not one to dwell too much on past results or future league tables. It's always about the next game. And I think when you've got a guy whose character is that way all the time, there's going to be nothing unusual about him taking that approach in the aftermath of a situation like this. It's like, let's put this into perspective, of our lives into perspective. Now, come on, let's put our energy into something positive like the next game, and let's move forward.
Absolutely. One, we've talked about really emotional topics, and of course, send my condolences to George Baldock's friends and family, and everyone connected with the clubs that he's represented. I wanted to talk to you, Mike, about Paul Warne, because in terms of psychological profiling, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but I think he's the most fascinating manager to study from that perspective, because I think so much of his success, and I put him in a similar category to Gareth Ainsworth here, has been based on culture setting and building togetherness. Perhaps, dare I say, more so than necessarily the sort of tactical and technical element. But I think that the vulnerability that Paul Warne has shown in his career, I initially thought that might be a weakness at the start of his career, but actually it's probably proven to be a strength.
Well, I do agree he's fascinating, mainly because he's so open and he gives you so much to, like, every single interview. He's just, heart on the sleeve type.
Yeah.
He just reveals everything what's on his mind. I think, strength or a weakness. I think it's a strength behind closed doors with his players and that team building and the bonding aspect of things. I think he's very much tribe above self, and he really unifies a group. But then I also think it's a weakness in public in terms of the messaging sometimes he sends out. I think he's a bit too, I don't know to say a bit too respectful of opposition, but I feel like there's a lot of limiting beliefs that he puts out in public in his post-match interviews. I think back to the times when he struggled with Rotherham in the Championship. It was like almost a different version of Paul Warne. In League One, you got, the enthusiasm was undeniable, but then you get into the Championship, and there was this kind of scarcity mindset came in of like he used to refer to a point in the Championship as like a gold nugget. And it's like, you've got to get 50 of these points. So if you're referring to one as a gold nugget, what kind of tone are you setting there publicly of, expectations? So that's my concern with Warne and his emotions, and he's at this level, at Championship level compared to League One level. But in terms of what goes on behind closed doors and the way that he brings a group together, I think the one thing we can all see with Paul Warne is he's a sort of manager you think you'd love to play for. You'd love to be in his environment. You can imagine you go to work every day and it's an enjoyable experience. So behind closed doors, I think his authenticity, the way he is with people, is a great thing.
He's somebody, Ollie, isn't he, who kind of cares for his players as human beings first and as footballers second. And I think that's one of the big things that you'd ask for of a manager.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, actually, thinking about that sort of character of Paul Warne and how we've seen him grow through his time with Rotherham and then obviously moving on to Derby. But the podcast, though, that came out a few years ago where they were behind the scenes with him at Rotherham, I think it was towards the end of a season 3 years ago, was it, just coming out of COVID? And I thought that was really interesting in terms of the way that he was with his players. I think there was, at the time, they were talking about a player taking a little bit of paternity time with his new young son, and sort of hearing his engagements with that, the way that he was sort of giving them a little bit of time and space. You could hear the old school mentality a little bit come out when he was talking about the environment. But I think that really showed you that he does care for his players and that he's there for them to try and make sure that they have got that opportunity to take the time they need to have personal reflections, to feel their emotions, and to be part of a family more than just being part of a football club, which is so important. And, you know, alluding to what Mike said, I'd run through a brick wall for Paul Warren. He's never even managed my club. I still think I'd run through a brick wall for him, because he's just got that kind of personality, got that kind of character, and he's somebody who you just love to see succeed.
I wanted to ask you about John Mousinho then, Mike, because he's somebody who's really stood out to me, possibly for different reasons to Paul Warren, but similar in the sense of culture setting, which is he seems to be very good at reframing challenges as opportunities and having a positive mindset, whilst also having the emotional intelligence to lead people and to treat players as human beings first. But he always seems to be able to have that kind of reframing quality, which I really admire.
Yeah, well, it's good timing this, because I've been looking at John Mousinho the last couple of days. And yeah, I agree again, totally, 100%. He is very much about human relationships first. What strikes me about him at the moment, what's top of mind right now, and with Portsmouth winning it, I think Pompey are going to be fine this season. I think they're going to be fine. And, you know, it's easy to say that now they've finally got that first win out of the bottom three. It's like good timing to turn around and say that. But it's just the way that, you know, you think of that 6-1 defeat at Stoke and the way he's handled it. And, you know, they went into that international break on the back of that 6-1 defeat and then couldn't beat Oxford at home. You're looking for the big reaction against Oxford a few days later, and it didn't come. They ended up dropping 2 points. And then you've got a stew on it for 2 weeks. And I thought they were meeting QPR at a bad time, because I thought we were looking to get a reaction out of QPR in that first game back. And Cifuentes having 2 weeks on the training ground with his players, you think he'd knock them into shape and they'd be ready to come roaring back. And to go a goal down in the first 10 minutes when you've conceded early goals, or when you've not started games particularly well and come back, I think it speaks to the fact that I think he's framing things very well behind the scenes and keeping everybody's, you know, I don't think there's any sense of being overawed. I just think that this thing of never getting too high, never getting too low. You know, he after the game at QPR, he said to his players, it's really important that you enjoy this now, because sometimes, you know, the negatives loom larger than positives. You can dwell on a defeat for too long, but then the Championship gives you another game in 3 days. And I really want you to enjoy this win now, even though we've got to prepare for Cardiff on Tuesday. It's really important over the course of the season that we don't stew on a drop points against Oxford and a 6-1 defeat for 2 weeks, and then we only have 2 days to celebrate a win. It's like, really soak this in now. This is important. This is why we're here. And I just think it's a brilliant message to send out, because, you know, it's like you can just get lost in it so quickly. And if they were to lose at Cardiff on, you know, tomorrow night, it's almost like that win never happened. So he's really, you know, I think little emotional tricks like that to get into the heads of the players and make the wins feel like wins is important. I think he's a good gauge like that.
Do you would you rate him as the same personality type as Gareth Ainsworth, Mike? Because I think they've both got very similar qualities.
No, I thought you was going to say Gareth Southgate then.
Oh right, no. I think Gareth Ainsworth, just because I look at Gareth Ainsworth and anytime you listen to him speak, you always feel more positive about teams after his interview, and I do feel similar about John Mousinho in the way that he sort of reframes challenges as opportunities, and that's how they've been able to overcome some of those sort of hurdles that they face both in League One and in the Championship.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is, well, it's dealing with emotions first more than logic. Is the you know, the first thing you think about is the way you make your players feel, rather than what's true or what's right or what's logically going to win us. It's like, no, the most important thing is buy-in. The most important thing is the emotions of the players. You know, that whole thing about, you know, a good game plan, a brilliant game plan's worth nothing if nobody buys in, but a bad game plan with total buy-in's always got a chance. Yeah. And if you get the players on side, you've always got a chance of winning any game, and it's just keeping those spirits up and keeping everyone.
I suppose you're maybe not so sure about the Ainsworth comparison. I suppose the difference I would make if I'm going down that route is I think with Gareth Ainsworth, it's probably more extreme, where I think when he was at QPR, he did this thing at the sort of culture session where he got a Kiwi in who was kind of playing his, I'm sure you remember that, playing the some sort of instrument, and he was half naked, and it was kind of like really out there as a sort of culture setting technique. I don't think Mousinho is quite that radical, and I think he's probably more in touch with the majority of modern players, whereas I think Gareth Ainsworth is more niche, and he needs like to find that 5-10% of players that like are just willing to go, I'm going to really buy into this. Whereas I think Mousinho can manage, is a bit more flexible, I think.
Yeah, I think with Mousinho, I think what he possibly does that's different from Ainsworth is I think Mousinho picks he understands the personality of his players and is more adaptable from player to player. Whereas I think Ainsworth likes a type of player that's got something to prove, that has basically, has got some backstory in the career, that they've faced rejection at some point, or that they've had to come back from a really difficult situation. People are writing them off because of their age or whatever it might be, and he just uses that as a thing that he twists that dial all the time and taps into that thing that gets the most out of that player. Whereas I think with Mousinho, you can any player of any background, he wants to know what makes that player tick, even if he's never encountered that player before. And I think he's more about group emotions as well. I think Ainsworth likes to tap into the individuals and really get all the individuals fired up. Whereas I think Mousinho can read a room. He walks into a room and he generally sees the energy of the room, and he picks up the energy of the room rather than going around on a one-by-one basis. I think that's how I would see it.
Okay, interesting. Ollie, do you want to pick out a Championship manager you're curious about?
Oh, well, I'm interested because obviously this might be a bit broader than me just picking one. I'm almost opening the floor for you a little bit, Mike. But one of the things I'm really interested in, obviously, we've talked quite a lot about emotional intelligence there. We've talked about sort of the extremes on that side of it with Wilder, with Warren. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Mousinho there and his style of working on the emotions of his team. What do you see as being the opposite side of that? Where is the opposite side of this in the Championship in terms of those who are maybe a bit less emotionally based in terms of their way of working with their team, but having that kind of tactical intelligence that comes around it that's maybe making up for some of that gap?
Yeah, well, it's always interesting because, you kind of looking for you expect a 50-50 spread of logical managers, emotional managers. If it was to look at logical managers now in the Championship, and just because of, like, everybody does everything. So just because a manager's primarily logic based doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't have the emotional skill set. But the obvious one is Carlos Corberán. I think that he's a very, very logical tactical. In fact, funnily enough, I think most of the Spanish managers in the Championship are very logical. Cifuentes also. We spoke in Spanish then, and I said también. Cifuentes, Pelash.
Regis Labrie, I know he's French, but I would probably put him in a logical category.
Yeah, absolutely. From early indications, 100%. So yeah, there's a few in there. I'm trying to think of logical. You see, this, you could be getting into something here, sort of broadening the pattern even further. That I think a lot of the successful British managers nowadays tend to have to be quite high up on the emotional intelligence side of things. We're talking about Thomas Tuchel taking the England job, and then what it says about English coaching, and the big debate about Spanish badges and just how many coaches there are in Spain. Are they another level tactically? But the English game is about more than just tactics. It's so much more. That's why there's such a fascination with English football from abroad, is because there's just so much emotions wrapped up in the games compared to, everybody plays 4-2-3-1 in Spain or some variation of the same brand of football, where all these coaches want to come to England because you're challenged in so many different ways. And it's not just about the tactics. But I think there's a trend at the moment that a lot of these foreign coaches are coming in with a more advanced coaching tactical background in terms of their upbringing and the foundation that they were built on in their own countries. but the emotional skill set's more with the British managers.
Interesting.
I mean,
That's really
that's
interesting.
just top of the head. You know, I've not really looked into that.
No. Okay, interesting. So, what do you think is more important? Do you think there's an area of management that's more important, logic over emotion? Or
I think the emotional side, it's a 51-49, but I think the emotional side, like I say, with the buy-in of game plans, if you don't get buy-in, the game plan doesn't work. So
I actually think, Mike, maybe, sorry to cut across you there. I think maybe higher up the pyramid, I think the logical becomes more important, because I look at managers like Paul Warne, like Gareth Ainsworth. I don't know why I keep mentioning Gareth Ainsworth, but managers that have done really well in League One. Haven't necessarily, Warne's doing a great job this season, but previously in the Championship, possibly been found wanting a little bit on a technical and tactical level. Gareth Ainsworth possibly the same. I just think once you get into the top two divisions, I think obviously you need both. I know you need six, but I think I would maybe say that the higher up you go, the more important the logical side becomes. Would you say?
I'd say the logical side of football becomes more important. I don't think it's necessarily that you have to be a logical personality manager. I just think your tactical game and your coaching game has to be on point.
Yeah.
You know, let's put the emotions to one side. If you're not at a certain level in terms of the quality of your training sessions, your philosophy, or your ability to adapt within games and your players' intelligence, I think all the motivation and emotions in the world, you know, everybody gets to a certain level of emotional intelligence, you know, but it's ultimately, if you're leaving a gaping hole on a pitch, then a better tactician is going to exploit it. If you're all things equal emotionally.
So, I wanted to ask you, Mike, about Wayne Rooney, and because I think he's obviously a very curious manager to study, because we've been aware of him, anyone into football, for the last 22 years. So, I'm curious to ask: do you think that Rooney is actually, because he had this reputation of a player of being very hot-headed and very on edge. I don't necessarily know that I see that in him as a manager. I think he's actually become quite calmer and maybe more, maybe more of a composed presence, dare I say, on the touchline.
I think what I would say is that none of this phases him. He's very comfortable with it all because of the level he's played at, managing lower levels, not necessarily high stakes for him. And he's also comfortable with high stakes. So it's not, he's not somebody who this is all or nothing for him. He wants to succeed. I've absolutely no doubt about it. He keeps coming back for more. So I've no doubt that he's got a real desire to succeed. I also think that it's, we shouldn't jump to conclusions too quickly on his track record so far, because he is a sort of manager that doesn't come in with a set style of play. He doesn't come in with a philosophy that he's going to stick to come hell or high water. He waits for, again, we're talking very similar to Chris Wilder in some sense, that he's very streetwise. There's an aspect of him that's similar to Wilder. He's comfortable with chaos. He's very real world, sort of streetwise, real world experience. Let's take the Sunderland game, for example, when they turned Sunderland over. I think Sunderland were unbeaten at the time, top of the league.
Yeah, they actually had 100% winning record at the time.
Yeah, and Wayne Rooney's approach that day boiled down to one simple thing: Sunderland look young. Let's get stuck into them. Let's get big older players on the pitch. Let's get stuck into them. Sometimes football can be that simple, and if you're streetwise enough to have played at every level for so long and seen what works and what doesn't work, you can see a team roll up like that in great form, but they look young, and you can just throw chaos into the mix. You can just take them out of their comfort zone and win a game that nobody's expecting you to win. And I think that's the way that Rooney's likely to be underestimated, is that he will solve more and more problems over time, but don't expect any continuity necessarily or anything that's building. It's just, it's just him calling on his experience, and the longer a team spends together, the more they get used to each other, and will improve that way anyway.
I think that's really interesting, particularly about obviously how he's learning and developing himself in terms of how he's running his team and being flexible around where that comes together. I think one of the things that, and I don't know anything about psychology, I'll admit that, with half an hour in by now, whoever's here, still here now, they're committed, they're watching the full thing. I don't know anything about psychology, I'll be fair. But one of the things that always seems to come for me anyway, when I'm thinking about these big managers who have dropped down, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Wayne Rooney, one of the things I'm always, I don't know whether worried about or excited by, is the impact that their presence will have on the players within that training ground. I think it was a famous story about one of the famous French players where they'd said, why can't you do this? It's really easy. I can just put ball in top corner. Why can't you? And I'm always worried about that kind of ego impact when a player like Wayne Rooney drops down to the Championship with players who are very good, but obviously not on his world-class level. How do you see Rooney in terms of managing that side of the game to make sure that the players aren't overawed by his presence, but also that he's not dismissive of the fact that they've not got his same level of ability?
Yeah, I think that, I think there was a grit to Rooney as a player. I think he appreciates. I think he was a lower league player that just had the talent to play at the very top.
Right, okay, that's interesting.
I think Rooney would have quite happily played out a whole career in League Two. I don't think, just like his brother has. His brother's still doing the rounds in non-league.
Yeah.
I think, so he's of that background in Rooney's case, but I think it's a valid point you make generally about top-level professionals. So I think in Rooney's case, I don't think it's necessarily an issue. I also think as well, Frank Lampard, likewise, I don't think it's necessarily an issue for him. I think he was a hard-working sort of, appreciates the work that goes into building a player's career as opposed to, his natural talent. So yeah, it's a very valid point you make generally about top-level players. I think what the main thing that strikes me is these top-level players do get more opportunities than the average coach. They're allowed to fail once or twice and can still keep getting jobs. But, I do think there is some value to their experiences, especially when they're players like Lampard and Rooney, where their saviour is, like Wilder, the real-world experience. So when you've played, that appreciation of the different levels. So Rooney might be... Well, you talk of Rooney going to getting the Birmingham job last season, and it was a mad decision that everybody saw it as a mad decision. But also when you were trying to make the case for, okay, well, what's the long-term vision? It's like, okay, Rooney might be learning on the job now, but if he gets them to the Premier League with the money and the budget that they've got to have some clout in the transfer market in the coming years, if they get to the Premier League won't faze him. There's nothing in the Premier League that he won't have encountered before. So, it's, he's willing to come down to these levels. He should be willing to. He can't just expect a Premier League job. But the point is he's perfectly happy at this level, I think, to really get stuck in and try to make a career out of it. But the learning's more now in learning this level that he never played at, I suppose. So maybe in that sense, we should be not necessarily jumping to judgments too quickly.
Interesting. I suppose on the other side of the sort of spectrum is Neil Harris, non-league striker in his day. I think went to Millwall from Cambridge City. I can't remember if it was direct. I think it might have been directly from Cambridge City. So my sort of novice personality profiling of Neil Harris is extroverted intuition. I think he seems to like connecting with people, and he seems to like he being honest and sort of speaking his mind. And I think he seems to be the kind of person who is comfortable making snap judgments. So does that sort of tally with your sort of studying him as a professional psychologist?
I'd go with 70-80% of that, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that.
It's the intuition thing early that got me. So Harris, okay, first thing, tribe above self, 100%. Yeah. Like the number of different ways he references Millwall-like, Millwall-esque, Millwall performance, Millwall-less, just everything's tribe first. It's all about the emotions of the tribe. It's all about rallying rallying behind a cause together. Snap decisions, yes. I think that he's a decider first and foremost. He lives in the world of decisions and not necessarily overly worrying about processes or, it's all about outcomes. It's all about end results. It's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about the desire of your defenders and, like putting your bodies on the line and what your players do in the opposite box. And, he tries to win territory. He's very territorial approach in the way tactically. But I wouldn't say there's an awful lot of nuance to
Agreed. Yeah.
Play. So yeah, that's pretty much it, I'd say. Yeah.
What was the extra 20 to 30%? I'm curious.
It was the intuition. Like there is intuition there, but it's not necessarily pattern recognition. It's just the way things have always been done. We are Millwall. This is what we do. We always do things the same way. We don't.
So can you help me clarify this then, Mike? Because this might stray more into the area of psychology itself than football. So intuition, right? I tend to think of intuition as making judgments very quickly. It's like a sixth sense where you don't. It's like something just doesn't feel right, kind of thing, or something does feel. Whereas the opposite of intuition, which I think is sensing, is more evidence-based and more real-world stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, it's totally understandable that you make that point. I mean, this is mostly semantics. Okay. Officially using this model, intuition, people use the word intuition for basically instinct. If you have an instinct for something, but instincts are generally emotional. If you do something instinctively, it's, your limbic brain's just reacting to some fear, and I get a funny feeling about this. I don't like this, or whatever it might be. Intuition basically is pattern recognition. So it's one of the best ways to explain this probably is so sensing and intuition. You're watching a theatre play or something like that. Somebody who's a sensor just watching what's in front of the curtain and what's going on in front of your eyes. Intuitives just can't help the mind wandering, thinking, I wonder what's going on behind that curtain. What's gone into this production?
Right.
What's actually going on? And instead of actually watching what's in front of their eyes, they're actually thinking what's going on behind the curtain. So it's like you get the same with football. It's like, I really struggle to watch a game of football and actually just watch the game and my mind not start wandering to patterns, basically.
Right.
I've just seen something there that I remember from a game before. And then I'm trying to think of the game, and then I'm trying to think of the pattern, and then I'm trying to make the connection, and all of a sudden 5 minutes or 2 or 3 minutes of the game has passed, there's a goal, and it's like, what happened there? I didn't see that.
Yeah.
And that's just intuition running away. It's trying to recognize patterns of something you see, and then nothing to do with the game. You're thinking about something else entirely because you're trying to join the dots and make patterns.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I wanted to talk to you about Mark Robins, Mike, because it's been a really difficult season for him so far, particularly in the sense that he's lost his right-hand man, Adi Vivash. And I'm wondering, when you have a dynamic, I think he's worked with Vivash for a number of years, where Mark Robins is very much, I think, big picture, almost a little bit like a director of football, even holding the title manager, whereas Vivash is very much on the grass with the players. And whereas Vivash is a very decorated and esteemed coach, this season, Vivash has gone and replaced by several coaches that have all kind of been promoted from the academy. And it's almost as if I wonder if Mark Robins is now having to coach the coaches, if you like, and inform them, as opposed to already meeting Adi Vivash sort of on the same level. And I'm kind of wondering how that might have affected the dynamic at Coventry City.
Yeah, I think it's a big point. But you've just made a good case for it there. It's not something I've looked into in that much depth, and I've gone. I've got my own concerns about Mark Robins at the moment now, and the trajectory of because everything has a shelf life, and he's done an absolutely amazing job, but the expectations were so high at the beginning of this season because it was natural that they were, because they've been steadily progressing now for so long. And the natural next step now is that you're guaranteed top six and on for automatic. But it's not necessarily that straightforward when you've got 3 or 4 parachute clubs at least that should be ready to challenge straight away and other contenders. And you get off to a bad start, and all of a sudden, you're kind of on this slippery slope now that Coventry might not be far away from the point where they're beginning to see their own season as a write-off if they don't start picking up points soon. And it's a really bad place to be. The only thing I would say is that we've seen before with Robin's teams is that they've had so many things down the years with not playing at their own stadium, with all kinds of troubles at the beginning of a season, and then they always come on strong as the season goes. And I think Robbins has referenced this himself. We always tend to finish seasons stronger than we start them. But as far as the season goes, I just find it really worrying because they were everybody's dark horse, I think, before the season began. It was no secret that this was a team that was potentially ready to go and take the division by the scruff of the neck and be right in amongst it. And to be nowhere, it's not just the fact that they've dropped so many points, and it's some of the games they've lost. Norwich at home, Swansea at home, Preston away. They shouldn't be losing these games if you've got any ideas of being in that top 6. And it's just, the pressure's ramping up a little bit too much too soon for me. That makes me wonder, is this going to reach a natural, what's the threshold for Doug King and the new ownership now at Coventry? Where are their expectations and how much loyalty are they going to have to Robbins and at what point? Because there was talk at the weekend at Preston that it was only a few, very, very much a minority, but fans venting at the players and Robbins saying the players can't handle it. The fans need to realise these players can't handle that criticism because they don't see what they're doing wrong, because they're not doing an awful lot wrong. They're just coming on the wrong side of fine margins. So if you compound the issue by really going after the players at full time, even if it's only a few people, it affects the players, and it's only making. And I just feel like the pressure's building because the expectations were probably just a little bit too high pre-season, understandably. But now after these results, though, the gap between expectations and reality is huge, and I think it's just putting on loads of pressure. So how patient they'll be? You'd love to think that no matter what, Robbins is still in charge in the new year, and I'm sure it will sort itself out on that level, even if they don't finish top 6. There'll be a lot of learning to take from this season, but I don't think it's not shaping up to be anything like the season anyone expected.
No, I think there's a number of factors. I think definitely probably Coventry need to bring in a coach that's got a bit more pedigree. I think that seems to be quite an important thing. Probably need a bit of experience in January because, yes, they did invest in the summer, but a lot of it was on sort of future assets, and a group of future assets doesn't necessarily come together straight away and deliver results. Yeah, hopefully, maybe it's just a case of tweaking the coaching setup a little bit. Ollie, you curious to hear about Paul Heckingbottom? Because obviously he's a manager that you saw a little bit of at Sheffield United, winning promotion to the Premier League in 2023.
Yeah, really interested in some of that analysis of Heckingbottom, but also I think because one of the things I always said, and this is, I don't mean this, it's tongue in cheek, but one of the things I used to say when we got Heckingbottom is that we'd just got Wilder light. We'd gone for somebody with the same emotional profile, the same coaching profile, but who wasn't potentially as tactically astute as Wilder had been in terms of the way that he devised the Sheffield United team in terms of getting promotion. From that sort of psychological aspect, Mike, is that completely unfair to Paul to suggest that we were looking for somebody in the profile of a Chris Wilder and we pulled a Paul Heckingbottom from that hat?
I could see the similarities when he took over. I did feel like it was, I've got a very high opinion of Chris Wilder and what he's achieved. And, the jury's still out a little bit on Paul Heckingbottom. Great promotion 2 seasons ago. But, he's, I think he's a born leader. I think he's a leader of men. I think he does, that emotional intelligence side from a masculine perspective. I think he rustles the dressing room together and he gets everyone, he sets certain standards and he won't let people drop below those standards. I think he's very good at managing players in that way. I think he is more about people. I think Wilder's more, Wilder's just in it for the thrill of everything, the sensation of high stakes matches, biggest stadiums, absolutely nothing phases him. I think with Heckingbottom, it's more about Wilder's chasing the sensations of the environment and the thrill of the chase of the process, I suppose, if you want to call that a process. Whereas Heckingbottom deals with people. He's a decider. He deals with people, and you have to be the right type of person. And this is not. There's a lot of crossover here with Wilder, because Wilder is like that too, but not to the level that Heckingbottom is. Wilder's more balanced between tactics and emotions.
I can imagine, Mike, Wilder's good at I think Wilder embraces emotions in terms of the match and the doing the fist pumping and all that kind of thing. I think I imagine in terms of personal relationships, I imagine he's a little bit more call a spade a spade. Let's more about finding practical solutions to things and not necessarily and pretty level-headed, I suppose.
Yeah, well, level-headed. I think he has those two things in balance. I think back to one of his favourite phrases, and he always uses it for Sheffield derbies, is fire and ice. He likes it. There's times in a game where you really get stuck in a derby game and you play on the fire. And then there's times where you've got to cool your mind down and you've got to think straight, and you've got the ice side of it's got to come out. And there's a balance there between logic and emotions. With Heckingbottom, he's not necessarily as tactically astute, but the emotional side is very strong. In terms of the values that everybody works to, the values never change. The values are strong, and if we're all behaving the right way and conducting ourselves the right way, we're all following the right set of values, then everything will generally take care of itself. So I would say yes, there's a more straight talking. Well, I say that, I can imagine Heckingbottom's pretty strong when he wants to call someone out, but yeah, it's the same functions we're talking about. I think with Wilder they're just a little bit more in balance, whereas with Heckingbottom it's more about the values. It's more about how you are and how you conduct yourself as people.
Yeah, I think that hugely passes that test of sort of what we saw at Bramall Lane and how we've seen Heckingbottom sort of in terms of his development. Because I thought that emotional side was always strong in the way that he brought through a lot of our youth players. Obviously, he's worked for our under-21s first, brought then that into the first team and really saw a lot of development coming from some of our younger players. For example, Ryan Brewster, it's the only time I think in his short-lived Sheffield United career that he's shown any kind of sort of ability to break into this team, that he looked a little bit of a different man. And I think that emotional side of Heckingbottom was so strong in terms of pulling out and nurturing these young men and turning them into what he hoped was going to be good level professional footballers. And so I do think that was a real strength of his, that hopefully Preston, where he's coming to such a different environment from where Ryan Lowered potentially, from some of the noises we'd heard, created a little bit of a negative environment. That ability in nurturing those young men, in working with them, in building that emotional intelligence could be really important in terms of turning their season around from such a low place they were in at the start.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that he follows on from Lowe as well, because I don't think it's a massive disruption to what them players will be used to. As much as relationships might have become frayed under Lowe, I think the value set is very similar. I don't think Lowe was very tactical. It was, I think he gathered the tactics from his backroom staff. You see, this is the thing with a lot of managers, is you can turn around and say a manager's not very logically thought, but it doesn't have to be if he's got brilliant coaches around him who do all that for him and you work together as a team. But Lowe was also very values-based, group values, tribe over self, whereas in Lowe's case, it was more, the tribe shifted. As the fans turned against him, you're not in the tribe anymore. It's just me and the players now.
Right.
The tribe seemed to get smaller and smaller for Lowe the longer he was in the job. But he's very much as who's with me and who's not with me. And I think with Heckingbottom, so Heckingbottom comes in, and whatever's gone wrong under Lowe, he'll just identify certain things straight away and deal with them. And situations that were problems will be quickly resolved in a way that is not alien to the players, because you're still talking the language of values. You're not suddenly giving them loads of tactical concepts to try and take on board that they've never had to think about before. It's not drastic in that sense that you're swinging from one extreme to another. It's still values-based management.
Interesting. I wanted to ask you about Regis Lebris, Mike, because I don't know if you've had the opportunity to study him yet, because he only came in the summer. But I suppose he seems to be quite a calm operator, and he seems to my eyes, he seems to have been a sort of steady hand, whereby, you've just had a situation at Sunderland last season where they had three different managers last year, and in the middle of that, Michael Beale possibly caused a little bit of chaos with his management of things, whereas it seems like Regis Lebris has been able to implement a real coherent out possession strategy, which then allows the sort of talent in this squad to flourish.
Yeah. Well, you've helped me out there, Gab, because you've maybe given me something to think, because I don't know a lot about him yet. But the first two things I've picked up are control over chaos for sure, and he's a very logical manager more than he's not.
Yeah.
I'm not getting much emotions. I would imagine his emotions are probably fourth, like last of his functions. So yeah, that kind of ties in with that. His control is doing the same thing over and over again, pretty much, in terms of you want things done a certain way. You have a way that you want things done. It's just about drilling your way into the players and the players taking that on board. It never really changes from game to game. And I would imagine the logic is good of what he's asking of those players, that he is tactically astute. He is, making sure that, tactically there's no gaping hole. There's nothing, alarming ever that he's going to be out-thought on. That, Sunderland should generally always be in games on a tactical perspective, so long as they don't throw in a stinker as players. They stick to the plan of what they're told to do. A plan that doesn't really change from week to week.
Interesting. Danny Röhl then, Mike. I think what was really interesting to me about Danny Röhl is he seems to have, we've talked about emotion and logic as these two very broad categories. I'm sure in psychology there's a few more subcategories if we were to get really. But I think Danny Röhl, he seems to have a mixture of both, whereby you see him, he does play on the emotions and he can create these sort of hands up to the players after a big win and that kind of German culture. But yet, if you watch his teams play, there's also some really nuanced ideas there, where you'll have the right back tucking into midfield, and you'll have the midfielder pushing out wide, and you'll have these sorts of patterns of play that are really sort of advanced. So that suggests there's a real logic there, but he seems to have a really nice balance of those sort of psychological qualities.
Yeah, he's a curious one. He's not, again, he's one I'm not necessarily well up on. I tend to, unless there's a standout, something stands out about when a foreign coach first comes over, it's like, it's not always easy to translate when someone's not native language. So it's not as easy to latch onto functions. I do see him as a logical manager also. Mostly logical more than emotional. And when we talk about logic and emotion, we're basically like, if I was to give a definition for logic and add a bit more nuance to it, we're basically talking about, we're talking about the fact, like, logic is what works. It's whatever the truth is, the objective reality of something, the truth. So when you talk about tactics, you can't blur the lines with tactics. Either something works or it doesn't.
Okay.
It's like, you don't care about people's feelings. It's like, what's going to work? What's going to get the job done?
Yeah.
Whereas values-based emotional management is about values.
It's more nuanced, or it's more kind of in the balance, where you can have two different perspectives on the right thing to do in a certain situation. It's about kind of.
It's more about how the players feel first. I suppose the best way to look at it is a game plan and buy-in. There's a whole set of behaviours that are related to the buy-in, and there's a whole set of behaviours that are related to the game plan and executing the game plan. In terms of, and with Danny Röhl, I think he's more on that logical side. So yeah, I mean, yeah, he's a tough one. He's a tough one because he seems quite introverted. To listen to his interviews, so he's probably one of the least managers. If you gave me 10 managers at once who were new and I'd never encountered them, Danny Röhl would be somewhere near the bottom of the list of how soon I'd get round to them, just because of not native language, because he's quite logical in the way he speaks. He's not much flowery language or intonation, not many fantastic insights, quite
That's
introverted.
okay.
So,
Well,
yeah.
We'll focus on to finish off the English managers then. In terms of, I think Omar Ritza, I'm not sure if he's actually English. It is his native tongue, but he's quite new, so we'll kind of give him a miss. Scott Parker, John Eustace, Des Buckingham, Tom Cleverley. Ollie, which of those would you be interested to have a final deep dive on?
Oh, here we go. It's pressure now because I'm trying to read in Mike's eyes which one he wants me to say. Where do we want to go up and down that league? And I think it's really interesting because all of them have so many differences in terms of the way that they've come through. I think for me, the most interesting of them is Des Buckingham. I think when you look at that list of managers in particular, Tom Cleverley, I imagine, leans into a little bit of what we've talked about, particularly around some of that questioning about dropping down and sort of coaching at a level where you're not quite familiar. I feel like Des Buckingham is probably the most different compared to the managers that we've spoke about so far. So it'd be interesting, Mike, in sort of your reflections on how he's sort of come through and his sort of role in the overperformance of Oxford United since he has been able to take the reins there.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd say about Des Buckingham is for somebody who is, only 30 games or so into an English management career, he is so polished because he's been away and done the work, and he's been to India, he's been to New Zealand, he's picked up a lot of concepts and stuff. I see a manager that's trying to do all of his four functions. He's not just about one thing with him. He's trying to do many different things. He's tribe above self by nature, but he's logic above emotions, I think is the way I would say it. But he has the emotional game dialed in because of this whole, he's really big into the Maori culture. When he went to New Zealand, he learned about the Maori culture. Now phases a lot of that into his management style of, buying into a cause of like how the Maoris do things and how they feel connected. And it's in some cases connected to the history of the club and everybody else who's tied into the club, not just the,
Just on that, Mike, that's a really interesting point that you've raised. Do you think it's easier for younger coaches to embrace things like the Maori culture and take that into their own work, whereby older managers, dare I say, might find it harder to embrace a new idea like that because they'll feel like they've already got their template in place and it's been successful?
Yeah, it's an interesting, right. So there's a couple of interesting aspects to this because basically, if you don't have a football career, you've got a 15-year head start on a player that's had a full professional career. So you can go away and do all sorts in that time and build up your skill set and learn all of these different things. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is, we're talking about British coaches and Spanish coaches, for example, and there's only maybe a couple of thousand pro licensed coaches in England, and there's 12,000 in Spain. We're talking about a manager who's developing his skill set in the emotional realm and all these different ways to manage players that are perfect for English football, all these other elements. But again, we're talking about a coach that, possibly some of the Spanish coaches might be ahead of him because whereas they're more logical, tactically minded, more advanced, but Buckingham's got this more wide and varied skill set, which is not to say he's a mug tactically because he leads with logic. So I imagine, and he's, the different ways that he's got results already so far from a standing start with an Oxford team that's just been promoted suggests that he's no mug tactically. We'll wait and see over time. No, it's only a small sample so far that, once Oxford become more of a known quantity. But I think there's a couple of interesting aspects there. I think if you start, the younger you start, the more you can get your reps in, the more you can iterate and more different things you can learn in so many different places, work in different countries. That gives you an advantage. But then, we're also talking about Rooney and Lampard getting third and fourth chances, where most managers that didn't have a playing career are lucky to get a second chance if they fail at the first job.
Well, that's the other thing, because I think if I listen to Frank Lampard on podcasts, I'll often feel like he's... I understand the instinct for sort of out-of-work managers wanting to spend time with their families, and so they've got young daughters, and their daughters aren't going to be a certain age for all the rest of it, all family reasons. But there's also part of me that knows of managers that are out of work. Mark Bonner, for instance, was out of work when he lost his job at Cambridge, and he spent loads of time going to Germany to study coaching, to watch games, all different levels, to add to, go into different businesses. Some managers do, learn cultural techniques, leadership, or everything to expand their portfolio. And they might even be, studying the game as well, and sort of keeping their mind sort of fresh in the market. Whereas I do feel a little bit with somebody like Frank Lampard, there's a sense that if I want to take a championship job, I can have it. So I might as well just spend some time with my family, which I sort of get. But also, I kind of feel like the industry, if you want to be the best possible coach in the modern era, you probably do need to put in the hard yards and devote your time even out of work. Whereas somebody like Des Buckingham, who's had 15 years developing their skill set on such a wide level, all those four functions that you mentioned, Mike, I think that gives them an advantage.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think that if, ultimately, in the end, managers will get found out of how much the time and effort they've put into their careers. And, if someone like Frank Lampard's got the advantage of all that experience, but now isn't going above and beyond to capitalise on it, then I think it will show in the opportunities that come his way further down the line. He might get another chance just because he's Frank Lampard, but then I would imagine if he's not done anything while he's out, he'd be found out. So, yeah, there's so many different talking points to this, I suppose, because, I agree with what you're saying. I feel like, the yards that some of these coaches that haven't had a distinguished playing careers are putting in is incredible. And I think it's just, I come back to this thing about the coaching again. I just think it's a shame that it's so difficult for these coaches to get into the system in the first place and get, I made this point last week with the Tuchel appointment that, this isn't about Spanish coaches being more intelligent or more hardworking than English coaches. This is a systemic thing that the more people you can get through the system, the more affordable the badges are and the licenses and all of these things that you have to do. The more people you push into the system, the better the guy at the top of the pyramid has to be to outcompete, with the competition that then it generates. So if you get to, at whatever level you've got this fierce competition because everybody's tactical coaching, it's all dialed in because there's so many people competing for so few jobs, then to be at the top of that pyramid, you've just got to be so much better than that guy has to be now on the, the tactical foundational level. But I think that English football is a more varied game that is about so much more than just tactics. And I think that shows in the quality of English coaches, that whereas we're talking about managers not measuring up to Tuchel, British managers on a elite level tactics, winning knockout matches on the very biggest stage, ultimately there's so much more to a British manager's skill set than just the tactical side as well.
Makes a lot of sense. Final one from me then, Mike. Do you have a point of view on the optimal personality type for a manager to achieve success in football, or do you just feel it varies so much and there's so many variables that it's just impossible to say?
No, this is the beautiful thing about this. I studied personality psychology, and I could have gone into an industry like engineering where everyone's an ISTP and everybody's kind of, there's all these different, same personality types doing the jobs, and but in football, the players this is why it's not all Wayne Rooney's and Lampard's in the dugouts from top to bottom, because it's not the most talented, a lot of the most talented players are DI, the SE. There's different functions going on, different parts of the personality.
What are DI and SE? Sorry, just
extroverted sensing. It's just like real world, sort of outer world sensory. Your ability to just see what's going on in front of your eyes very quickly and adapt to games. And DI is more self above tribe, which means you're so driven you don't need anybody to kick you up the backside to get up in the morning and do your reps. And Ronaldo and Messi both DI, self above tribe. I think the higher you go elite level, players just are self-motivating, self-determined, and then it's trying to manage all them egos all at the same time in one dressing room. But the beautiful thing about football management is there's just if you've got too much of one type. So say you had the Championship and you had 22 logical managers. I'd want to be with the high emotional intelligence managers in that division, because if you've got too much of one dynamic, then they all tend to cancel each other out a little bit.
Interesting.
And the guy who's got something different then has, so if these managers are all going above and beyond to develop their own careers, then naturally, it's a theory at the minute, but I feel like the more unusual you are for the division or the league or competition that you're in, you've got slight advantages from just being different. And there's so many, every personality type virtually is covered. There will be some variations.
Conversely, Mike, by the way, you could just as easily say if there's 22 emotional managers, then you'd want to have the 2 logical managers who have got that cutting edge tactical insight that no other manager's got. So it kind of works the other way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. It's just, we're in a game at the moment that is kind of dominated by the ideas of Pep Guardiola. There's so many managers now that follow his approach. So we're talking control through possession. We're talking, the emotional, logical side being in balance. So, we're having these conversations. There's a lot of very shrewd tactical minds out there, but there's also a hell of a lot of emotional intelligence. But the game at the moment favours the team in control. And I think these things go in cycles. And I think I at the moment have a liking for chaos managers that you can't predict what they're going to do next.
Yeah,
I much prefer to see those managers, because we're living in a time where everybody feels like they've got to have a process, they've got to do things the same way. You've got a philosophy, and does this look like my team out on the pitch today? And it's like I like the managers that you don't know what's coming next, you don't know what they're going to do tactically and stuff like that. So, and I think that the wheel will turn where that game to game tactical approach will probably begin to pay off more and more in the coming years, because I don't think these things stay the same forever.
Yeah, that fluctuates, doesn't it, in football? Like when tiki-taka became prominent, gegenpressing started to come into vogue because it's the thing that counteracts the other. I mean, eventually long ball football is going to come back into fashion to counteract the gegenpressing. So, Gareth Ainsworth for England. Oh, right, Mike, look, I've had such an interesting time with you this evening to talk about psychological profiling of managers. So thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be involved.
Yeah, cheers. Just before I let you go, what's the plan for Fox Punter, and what can people who subscribe to your work get, and what can you offer?
Well, yeah, I'd say keep an eye on the X feed for now. I'm gonna be doing a lot of Thomas Tuchel content between now and the next international break, because I read his book, only a biography about him from him, mostly about his time at Mainz, but all the way through to winning the Champions League with Chelsea, which gave me a brilliant deep dive on his personality. And there was so much gold there, and I was just thinking, I can't wait for Tuchel to come back somewhere. Little did I realise he was going to be the England manager. So now I've got all this content. I've got a month to generate as many different articles about Tuchel. And a good thing about it is it gives me a chance to, rather than just skim over a manager for one post, I can demonstrate just how deep this stuff goes by coming at Tuchel from about 15, 20 different angles.
Right.
Anecdotes and stuff like that. So that's basically going to be me for the next month on social media. I've just closed the sales campaign on the tipping service. There might be another sales campaign before Christmas. But the big thing is going to be the new year. I'm working on a course that basically, for coaches, for creators, for anyone really, how to learn how to type, how to profile. We'll use football managers. I've got 8 archetypes to show how this works, but it will be basically from beginning to end up to where I'm at now, my knowledge in, how to understand personality typology from, the code basically of what I'm using to decipher what's going on in managers' heads.
Well, you've certainly got one subscriber from this evening, Mike. I'm sure I'll be signing up to that one. Such a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much. Great to have you on as well, Ollie, as always, as our co-host. Thanks to you for watching at home. This has been the EFL Debate Championship podcast. Get subscribed to us on YouTube and on Spotify, and we'll see you again very soon.